heritage. Though there were singular moments of brilliance born abroad. The history of Daytona racing, a tale of great courage and brilliant innovation. A path marked by mechanical icons will follow an epic progression from walking pace to mind-bending speed. The history of Daytona racing is etched in the faces of superstars, but it also recalls the yeoman's work done by pioneers, less famous, no less important. Earliest contributors to a horsepower saga now stretching back 100 years. The history of Daytona racing, written in sand.
Hello everyone, I'm Dave Despain, sent back to Daytona yet again, this time with the assignment of coming up with something new, some facet of the racing down here that hasn't already been reported 100 times in the wave of publicity surrounding contemporary NASCAR. Well, it took a little digging, but you know what? I think I've found some stories you haven't heard before about the birthplace of speed. All right, stop. Hold it right there. That is indeed a very impressive 20-second look at the face of modern-day stock car racing, and hats off to the kids who edited it. But I'd like to pause at this point, stop that playback for a moment, and take a little time to appreciate what has gone before. Consider, for example, beach racing.
They're lined up there for the start down on Daytona Beach.
And the green flag. The race is on.
There goes one over the side and over again.
Ah, beach racing, you know all about that. Post-war sedans roar up the sand around a rutted turn and down the coast highway. Herb Thomas, the Block Brothers, Marshall Teague, familiar stories, but beach racing is so much older than that. 103 years old, in fact, and it answers an important question. Why Daytona? Why did this Atlantic Coast resort town become synonymous with racing in America? Why does today's 500 bear the famous first name Daytona? Why? Because of beach racing.
That beach was just exceptional. A hard-packed area like that is almost like pavement.
You could ride a bicycle and there'd be no indentation. You could put a bus on there and there'd be no indentation. It was really remarkable.
But the beach only became a racetrack because of this building, this remarkable hotel.
Of the famed Hotel Ormond, just one remnant still exists. This cupola sat at the very top of what was, for most of the last century, the largest wooden structure in the world. If indeed the beach is the birthplace of speed, this was the maternity ward. Headquarters for the very first race down here, a race promoted at least in part for the purpose of putting more guests in the hotel. And part of our assignment during this hour is to dig into the story of that seminal automotive competition, that first race, and perhaps to meet some of the fascinating characters who breathed first life into Daytona racing.
The apostolic lineage of racing at Daytona Beach, William J. Morgan was the first pope, and all the Francis have been successors.
Bill, in those days, you would never believe that he was a big promoter. I mean, he was a very laid-back guy, just like you and me.
What we have in mind, then, is a journey back through time, and I think I've found us the perfect car for the trip, an important piece of racing history down here. Now, if they can just get her to run. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to one of the most significant historical landmarks here in Daytona. That is the service station operated by Big Bill France during the Depression. And we've come here to explain why we're not going to talk a lot about the France family in this hour.
Follow me through a quick review. Third-generation NASCAR chairman Brian France now leads the sport, and it's much too early for history to judge his results. Prior to Brian, of course, his famous father, Bill France Jr., reigned as one of the smartest, most powerful men in racing. Commanding respect through 31 years at the helm, he made NASCAR a household name, the Daytona 500 its landmark. En route, he and younger brother Jim became billionaires. Some credit for that goes to the 79 500. The first live telecast of the big race unlocked the door to big corporate money. But we don't have time to linger over a TV landmark. Moving backward, we need to quickly reel in the France family thread through the salad days of cigarette sponsorship and Bill Jr.'s apprenticeship, honing his chops as a race promoter and sanctioning body president, mentored by his famous father. There's Bill France Sr. Many will tell you he's the answer to the question, why Daytona? With wife Annie at his side, conventional wisdom says Big Bill brought life to Daytona racing, and aren't we lucky he stopped here en route to Miami and opened that gas station. Oh, by the way, here's the proof there's nothing sacred. But is Daytona really the center of the racing universe because this beach racer turned promoter, Big Bill, made it so? Actually, there's a good bit more to that story.
There is no doubt that the operator of this service station unlocked the key to stock car racing's long-term success, and indeed, Bill France probably deserves credit for saving the sport from extinction early in its history. But don't for a minute think that he got the whole thing started. Let's imagine a timeline with the beginning of Daytona racing over here, 1903, and today over here. Well, Bill France arrived somewhere about here. And this is the period I'm most interested in. It dates all the way back to the birth of the automobile.
In the late 1800s, ambitious inventors first attached crude internal combustion engines to horseless carriages. But especially in America, early automotive technology was a tough sell.
The automobile in this country replaced the horse. It was quite a change, you know. People didn't really trust these cars that huffed and puffed and so forth. So you had to win the confidence of the American public. So speed was very important to creating interest in a product.
Case in point, 1897. Ohio carmaker Alexander Winton drove from Cleveland to New York in 71 hours, the first long-distance automobile trip. Nobody noticed, and Winton learned a lesson.
In '99, they decided to do it again with a reporter with them from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And they did press releases at every stop all the way along and everything else. And they completed, and they got a lot of publicity off of it. The factory went a little crazy after that. The orders started coming in.
Now I ask you, does that not sound like an early version of win on Sunday, sell on Monday? And spurred by that success, Winton started racing, often against fellow automakers, often on city streets. In 1901, he was undefeated. Almost.
Unfortunately, he lost one race that year that made everything kind of famous, and a fellow by the name of Ford beat him. And out of that, Ford got the financial backing to start his Ford Motor Company.
From there, Winton went on to star in the first ever race on this 23-mile-long stretch of beach, about which I need to make an important point. Down south, it's Daytona Beach. Up here, at its most historically important point in terms of motorsports, the locals are quick to tell you this is Ormond Beach.
And this special strip of sand solved a big problem for early racers. As speeds increased, America simply offered no place to run wide open. No paved roads, just rutted cow paths. This beach was a revelation.
One of the residents down here, winter residents named Birchwood, wrote an article extolling the virtues of the beach. He'd taken his car out and driven it on there and everything, and so he wrote about how it would be a good place to have automobile racing. And so he wrote that article, and it was printed in the Automotive magazine in December 1902.
Why it has remained for me to call the attention of my fellow motor vehiclists to this ideal spot for either a leisurely loaf or for a midwinter speed contest at which I'm sure every record of the world from 1 mile to 10 could be broken, I am at a loss to understand.
Well, Birchwood was spot on, and with help from a colorful British promoter whom we'll meet in due time, CW's vision of this natural phenomenon spread through the burgeoning world of automobile performance. And you just know what happened next, right? We'll be back with the story of the very first beach race.
Welcome back. I think we've established that the sands of Ormond Beach at the turn of the century were a unique national treasure, God's own racetrack, just sitting there waiting for the first motorized competition. But the historians do not agree on exactly how it all went down.
There's a lot of misinformation written about that first race, and as you read a lot of history books by qualified men, they've relied on terrible sources to write about that race.
We know the cars were Winton's huge Bullet versus the spindly Pirate of Ransom Olds, father of Oldsmobile. Contrary to popular belief, Olds didn't drive the race.
He came here with his foreman, H.T. Thomas, to drive the car. Now that picture hangs in some very impressive museums with the name under the driver as Ransom E. Olds, but he never drove the car. It was his foreman, H.T. Thomas, drove the car.
There's also been disagreement about when that race happened.
According to all these other people, they claim that they had a race in April 1902. Well, now the Pirate was not even built in 1902.
The Winton Bullet and the Olds Pirate were brought here in '03. Neither existed in the spring of '02. They couldn't have been brought here then.
But the biggest misconception about these two was passed on for decades and then written down.
Bill Neely wrote a book called Daytona, USA, describing how this first big race came about. He says, and we quote, "Ransom Olds drove his Pirate just over 50 miles an hour, returned to the library at Ormond Beach, bubbled enthusiastically to his friend Alexander Winton, who also owned an automobile company. You have no idea, Alex, what a thrill it is out there. Do you know what it feels like to go 50 miles an hour? Olds may not have been aware of it, but he had issued the first racing challenge in the history of the beach," unquote.
That's not the way it happened. It was not a gentleman's agreement.
It's a lovely story. It persisted for most of the 20th century. To this day, I want to buy it. I really, really do want to buy it. It's like telling me I can't believe in Santa Claus anymore, but it just ain't so.
Well, then how did this race come about? Well, Winton Olds and others came to Ormond Beach for a speed trial, individual attempts at the land speed record. To understand how they ended up side by side, we need to meet this flamboyant character, Senator William J. Morgan, the single most important player in our story.
William J. Morgan had a wonderful gift for language. He migrated first to Canada from England and Wales, then to the United States. One of his mentors was one Buffalo Bill Cody with his Wild West shows. And Morgan got a huge reputation back in his native Great Britain as a great showman.
Morgan was a lot of things, including a bicycle racer. He most certainly was not a senator.
He was racing at a Philadelphia fair, and apparently a state senator was supposed to speak at that event, and he didn't show up. So they asked Morgan if he would mind pinch hitting, and he said he would do it. And apparently he was such a spellbinder that everybody started calling him senator, and that sobriquet was his for the rest of his life.
Now a key connection. Remember C.W. Birchwood's passionate argument for Ormond Beach racing sent to the Automobile magazine? That landed on Senator Morgan's desk.
Morgan was working for that magazine, so he read the article. So they sent him down as an exploratory trip to see if the beach was what Birchwood said it was. And of course, when he arrived in February '03, he fell in love with the beach.
He got on a train, went to Ormond, was met enthusiastically by Joseph P. Price and John Anderson, the managers of the Ormond Hotel. He wanted to promote a race. The Automobile magazine was willing to put up the money to fund the show. The Ormond Hotel was going to become like Caesar's Palace at heavyweight fight time. When Morgan met Anderson and Price, that was the moment of conception of racing at Daytona.
Less than a year later, and 100 years before the 7-night minimum Speedweek's hotel stay, Senator Morgan and the Hotel Ormond pulled off the first race on the beach, and what a race it was. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In March 1903, Ormond Beach played host to an event that would, for years to come, make it the center of the racing world.
There was only 7 cars entered and only 2 race cars. But Alexander Winton came. He was, at the time, America's premier race driver. And from Lansing, Michigan came Ransom Olds.
They're car producers. They have a vested interest in promoting and advertising their car brands. They're 2 vastly different cars.
The Pirate was, only about 825 pounds, and the Bullet was over 2,000 pounds.
In those days, in the inverse of what we believe today, heavier meant faster, probably because it got better traction on the beach.
But again, how did 2 cars in 2 different speed trial classes wind up in a side-by-side race?
Now, they were running against time. They were here to run against time. But when you put those 2 sleek race cars on the beach at the same time, there's no way they weren't going to race. The boys will be boys.
Or, and this is the version I believe, clever promoter Morgan set the whole thing up, including a handicap start.
Winton agreed to let him get ahead 50 yards, and then he started up his engine, and took him a little while to get up to full speed, but it became an exciting race.
And at the finish line, 1 mile finish line, Winton overtook him by about a foot. So it was a very close race. That worked right into Senator Morgan's hands.
Morgan is both the promoter of the event and the primary journalist covering it. So he can write anything he wants to about this race. This was before the Wright brothers plane ever left the ground at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. This was the height of world technology. And he made it look so good that these were the 2 most exotic pieces of machinery on the face of this earth, and the rest truly is history.
Thus, a tradition was born. Every year, while most of the country was snowy and cold, competitors and fans headed to Florida for an annual celebration of speed. Sound familiar?
The 2 types of people who came here in the beginning were inventors who needed to demonstrate their product. In order to get investors, they had to demonstrate their product. Now, the other type of people that came here were rich playboys like William K. Vanderbilt.
Ah, yes, Vanderbilt. In 1904, Senator Morgan attracted to his 2nd speed trial the world's most famous Silver Spoon Daredevil.
You know, Willie K. Vanderbilt's physicians back in New York warned him that, that this going at high speeds was, could be doing damage to his heart and his eyes and his lungs and his liver. And they warned him, this speed, Willie K., just might kill you. Just the sheer velocity of it.
But Willie K. survived, and his presence attracted global attention. The whole world was watching this beach and would soon see something truly amazing.
100 years ago, Fred Marriott steamed down the beach at 127 miles an hour, one of the most significant records in the history of this place. Cause for celebration. We'll have that when we come back. Let's review. At the turn of the century, with a little prod from the Ormond Hotel, racing got started here on the beach. Alexander Winton and Ransom Olds, the first competitors. Then a flamboyant promoter turned the speed trials into an annual event, commemorated here. in a centennial celebration of speed and steam.
Welcome to the Stanley World Land Speed Record Centennial at the birthplace of speed, a gathering of more than 50 Stanley steamers. That's right, steam-powered cars. Lovingly restored, their owners ever watchful for that steamer nemesis, the scorched boiler, these cars make an important point about the early days of racing on the beach. Back then, innovation was the single most important key to racing success. For the beach speed tournaments, automakers showed up with all manner of power plants, from small singles and twins to multi-cylinder monsters.
At the turn of the century, there was over 200 auto manufacturers in the United States, and each one thought he might be the one to put America on wheels. But somehow it had to be demonstrated. And once they discovered little at a time that the beach was available, they came here.
And so this beach, uniquely suited to automotive go-fast, became a hotbed of competition. And in that high-performance cauldron, the 1906 achievement of this guy, Fred Marriott, is one for the books. The Stanley steamer he drove generated a modest 30 horsepower, but it had the torque of a locomotive, and that was the key. Keep in mind, speed records were being broken at least weekly, often daily, and sometimes several times an hour. Marriott steamed through the measured mile at 127 miles an hour, and that record stood for 4 years.
It was, at that time, the most astounding record. He passed all speeds by far. It was unapproachable by any gasoline car at the time, or any car, and was almost the end of the tournaments in Ormond Beach because it created such a stir throughout the automotive world. No one would come here to challenge it.
Now consider a major irony. The success of men like Marriott at finding speed on the sands of Ormond Beach eventually drove Ormond right out of the racing spotlight.
What happened there, as cars got faster, they need more miles to get their speed up, and so they had to come further south, and the condition of the beach a lot of times brought them further south.
Further south meant the measured mile eventually moved below Ormond to, you guessed it, Daytona Beach. There, by the middle of the roaring 20s, the racers were roaring ever closer to the 200-mile-per-hour mark. Senator Morgan's speed trial idea grew more popular than ever, thanks to a couple of his countrymen.
This incredible rivalry between two wealthy Englishmen, Captain Malcolm Campbell, billionaire from the diamond trade, and Major Sir Henry O'Neill Dehane Seagrave. Bitter rivals. In 1927, Sir Malcolm Campbell was dead set on becoming the first man to drive over 200 miles an hour. But he went off to South Africa and found a dry lake bed and thought this is the place to do it. Now, where is Seagrave going to run? He has read about Ormond, Daytona Beach.
Shrouded in secrecy, Seagrave shipped his massive land speed car to Florida, where his secret did not last long.
And he's met in the lobby by the media. And they say, "What do you intend to do here in Ormond, Daytona?" And he said, "I intend to become the first man to travel at more than 200 miles an hour."
And indeed, Seagrave did just that, March 29, 1927, with a new land speed record of just over 203 miles an hour. He one-upped his countryman and rival, but only temporarily, for it is Campbell who lives in history as Daytona's fastest man. The rest of that story when we come back.
Welcome back to Daytona, USA, and a pop quiz. Quick, what's the fastest anybody's ever gone at Daytona? The stock car crowd are quick to answer. Bill Elliott, 210 and change, en route to the Daytona 500 pole in 1987, the year before restrictor plates. Sorry, folks, Awesome Bill's efforts pale in comparison to the work of Sir Malcolm Campbell in this thing, Bluebird 5. March the 7th, 1935, Campbell roared down the sand at 330 miles per hour. He had a problem on the backup run, but still the average, 276.8 miles an hour, set the world land speed record at the time and remains to this day the fastest Daytona speed record. Say what you will about the pervasive popularity of modern-day stock car racing, the fact remains it was the land speed record crowd, from Winton and Olds to Campbell, who first engraved the name Daytona on the consciousness of the high-performance world.
Yeah, it was a celebration, really, the speed trials, and everybody was sitting on pins and needles waiting for a run to occur, and that's when the whistle would blow at the firehouse down on Beach Street and Orange Avenue, and the entire town would shut down, the schools would let out, and everybody would run to the beach.
And when those sirens went off, we climbed in the car and tore down the beach to get down there, and you sit for 45 minutes or for an hour waiting to say, here he comes, there he goes.
See that dot way up there on the beach? That's Campbell, and here he comes at 240 miles an hour.
Fun stuff, but what about the view from the cockpit? After setting a 1933 record, Campbell wrote eloquently about the experience.
The huge numbers to my left, set at each milepost, jump into my vision. My foot is hard on the accelerator. I see, as a thing detached, the yellow and black rectangular marker above the start of the mile. I press my foot down harder. I wait ages, it seems. Time does not fly, it creeps. At last, there's another rectangular yellow and black marker overhead. I find myself breathing again as though I had not before. I finish my record run. It has taken me seconds, just over 12, but it seems like ages.
But for beach racing, Campbell's success was counterproductive. Escalating speeds, which first shifted the racing limelight from Ormond to Daytona, eventually torpedoed the whole show.
Campbell makes this one last run, and he has a series of eerie slides. He almost loses it. He nearly buys the farm.
Add one last concern as Campbell's tire-shredding, broad-sliding, 330-mile-an-hour beast accelerated toward the measured mile.
To attain that speed, he had to start at the Seabreeze approach, and he had to go under the Main Street Pier. And if you can imagine driving a car at over 200 miles an hour and having to go through a couple of pilings in a bridge, I think that was what made him decide that I've had it on the beach, I've got to find a longer area that is safer.
And so the last Daytona Speed Trial was held in 1935. After 33 years of burgeoning success and dizzying velocity, Daytona's bread-and-butter event abruptly ended because the land speed crowd found a faster place to race.
The mayor of Salt Lake City is there anyway, courting Campbell, been wooing him for some time, saying, please come to this place we have out in the Utah desert. It's a place where I guarantee you you'll have more room to roam than here. We call it the Bonneville Salt Flats. With that, arm in arm, Malcolm Campbell and the mayor of Salt Lake City walk away into the sunset, and racing is dead in Ormond, Daytona.
That really left a flat note with all the businessmen in Daytona. Of course, they wanted the tourists to keep coming, so if it hadn't been for some civic-minded businessmen and the managers of some of the hotels, the bridge may not have been made over to stock car racing.
Fortunately for the multitude of modern-day fans, the tradition of oval racing at Daytona was about to begin. We'll relive the birth of stock car competition on the beach right after this.
Welcome back for a moment to contemporary NASCAR. Welcome to the Nextel Fan Zone. Nextel, of course, your official Cup Series sponsor. Over there, the Budweiser Pavilion. Budweiser, the official beer of Daytona International Speedway. And all of this makes an important point. I believe that corporate America, falling in love with stock car racing, has done more to change the look and feel of this sport for these fans than anything else in the last 103 years.
That all started in the early 70s when the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company first threw big money at NASCAR racing. The Fortune 500 followed suit, and that's a bit ironic when we remember the economic devastation into which this sport was born. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the country plunged into more than a decade of misery. For racing and for Daytona, the Great Depression was a mixed bag.
We know that it affected the auto industry. People just couldn't afford to buy new cars. But there were two industries that flourished during the Depression: the movie industry and auto racing. And the apparent reason was because of the need for entertainment.
Keep in mind, it was in the midst of these challenging economic times, 1935, when the speed trials, which had brought so much business to town, left town, went to Bonneville. Could have been a big problem for the community. Instead, it became an opportunity for guys in little garages like this, hometown heroes and homegrown race cars.
The city was very concerned that they were going to lose their racing heritage. I mean, here it's 1936. They had already been, racing for 33 years in the area. And it's like, we need to keep this thing going. Sig Hogdahl, who was the first driver to run 180 miles an hour, that run came on the beach in 1922, he came up with the idea for a stock car race.
The city fathers came to him and said, what are we going to do? Campbell's leaving. Going to lose a lot of tourists and, money. Publicity, greatest beach in the world. And so Dad said, let's go down the end of A1A and around to the beach and make a track. So that's what he did.
His move is really what saved racing in the area.
Well, how about that? It's Sig Hogdahl who gets credit for dreaming up the idea of Daytona stock car racing. And that first race was a glimpse of the future. Nationally known stars and even factory-built cars.
It drew a tremendous field. It was AAA sanctioned, which was fairly hard to do back then. And of course, Bill France was there, but he was just a local mechanic. Milt Marion came down from Long Island. He was a national dirt track champion.
Bob Saul, who was a native of my hometown in New Jersey, had got a car, a 36 Ford, that was built expressly for that race by the Ford Motor Company in its Edgewater, New Jersey assembly plant. Very few people were aware of that.
You had a tremendous array of cars. Most of them were V8s, little Ford V8s. Some of them were Auburn boat tails, pretty exotic. The Collier brothers had a pair of Willies, and the 27 cars started. And from what I understand, it was a bit of a fiasco.
The first race in 1936 was a disaster. The sand got deeper and deeper in that turn every time the cars tried to go through. Before the race was over, there were 10 or 15 cars just stuck in the sand, just sitting there. And so I don't think they really know who won the race.
They had to stop the race 2 or 3 times to pull the cars out of the sand. They had to cut the race short because the tide was starting to come in. And Milt Marion was awarded the win.
Indeed, Milt's Ford never got stuck and never stopped in that pivotal 1936 race.
Now here's a thrill. A drive on the original beach and road course, and oh, to have been a young buck with a car like this back in those days, huh? Daytona's transition from the old speed trials to stock car racing was an important moment in history. Wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, and the whole enterprise might well have fallen right through were it not for the efforts of the 5th place finisher in that 1936 race, one William H.G. France.
The city put on the race, and they lost about $20,000, and they weren't too sure about this stock car thing, but the local racers wanted to keep it going.
Bill became enamored with the idea of the beach road races after that first race, and he became more and more involved each year. It was just something he kind of grew into.
So the 1938 race was coming up, and Bill France, being the racer, wanted to continue to race. A friend of Bill France's was a fellow named Charlie Reese, who was pretty well off, and he had a few nightclubs in town. And he told Bill, he said, look, you know racing. I've got the money, let's give it a shot. See what happens.
It was good for the town after they saw what was going on and how many people came down there to it. It was good for the town.
Bill, in those days, you would never believe that he was a big promoter. I mean, he was a very laid-back guy, just like you and me.
Guided by Big Bill, natural-born promoter, beach stock car racing became a success for the city and a challenge for the drivers.
You didn't have the traction on the beach that you did on the asphalt.
I had to put my hand out the window to wipe the salt water off of the windshield so I could see, and my arm was black and blue.
It was faster on the back road than it was on the beach. It seemed like every time we'd get on the beach, we had a headwind.
You had to save your brakes for that turn going into number 2. So it was real interesting. It was a real contest, you might say.
To sum it up, the crowds were big, the course was tough, and the cars were stock?
Right from the showroom. Stock, and absolutely positively stock cars. A little few tricks from the trade were used in those days. For example, they take the field coils out, and that would give the engine a couple more horsepower, and the car would run its race on the battery. That was the first cheating that we ever saw in stock car racing.
And so another tradition is born, and we need a break. When we come back, the Depression ends with a bang and stock car racing explodes in the aftermath of World War II. America's Great Depression ended abruptly with a very big bang. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the U.S. into a two-front war. Overnight, an economic giant on its knees through years of depression sprang to its feet and cranked up production. Americans were rushed back to work. Idle auto plants quickly reactivated for the construction of tanks and troop transport. Industry boomed. And when the war was won, the boys came home, married their sweethearts, moved into new neighborhoods called subdivisions, and created the baby boom. But among those returning warriors also came a significant number of dyed-in-the-wool hell-raisers, including some highly decorated war heroes who weren't quite ready for quiet life in suburbia with a wife and a couple of kids. Red Byron, destined to be NASCAR's first champion, a decorated pilot badly injured when he was shot down over the Aleutian Islands. Joe Weatherly, who later died at the wheel of a race car, took a bullet from a German sniper in North Africa. Bud Moore, who went on to great fame as a car owner, wounded during the D-Day invasion.
These guys had made it through the war. They had seen the horrors of war, and they felt invincible. So they were ready for something to keep that rush going.
For those guys, stock car racing was just the ticket. The sport grew quickly, but it was an organizational disaster.
It was a tremendous problem in automobile racing. All you needed to put on an auto race was a roll of tickets and a fairground you could rent. And in many cases, by the time the green flag fell on the main event of the day, the promoter had left with the day's receipts, so the drivers didn't get paid. And that was commonplace. And one of the things Bill France wanted to do was see to it that the drivers got paid, and he called it guaranteed purses, which was one of the precepts of NASCAR.
This is the Streamline Hotel, looking not a great deal different than it did on a momentous week back in 1947 when Big Bill France organized a meeting on the top floor in the Ebony Room, a meeting that forever changed the course of stock car racing.
It was just an open door for car owners, drivers, mechanics, anyone interested in racing.
Bill France felt that racing had to have credibility. It had to have a uniform set of rules where if you lived in Florida, you wanted to race in North Carolina, you wanted to go to Connecticut, you could race.
Well, compared to a photo finish on the racetrack, this may not be much to look at, but this meeting is one of the most important moments in American racing history. Today, the Ebony Room is just a bar. 58 years ago, that gathering of promoters, car owners, drivers, and other interested parties was determined to bring order to a sport in chaos. Order came in the form of an organization known as NASCAR, National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, born literally right here in Daytona.
With the organization that would control the sport firmly in place, there was just one more item of business.
To elect a president, and which France was qualified for.
It's said that when Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of France, he would not wait for the Archbishop to crown him, that he seized the crown from the Archbishop and placed the crown on his own head. And at these Streamline Motel meetings, it's pretty clear that Bill France seized the crown and put it on his own head. And by the time he walked out of the Streamline Motel, he owned stock car racing nationwide for himself and his heirs in perpetuity.
That meeting sealed a deal a half-century in the making. Born on the beach way back in 1903, racing put Daytona on the map. 45 years later, Big Bill established himself as stock car racing's #1 power broker. And because his heirs never relinquished that role, Daytona, home of the France family, remained at the forefront of American racing. Since then, of course, Greater Charlotte, North Carolina has become the operational hub of the sport. Brian France even owns a home there. The majority of NASCAR teams are headquartered within a short hop of Lowe's Motor Speedway. Nearby Mooresville ambitiously bills itself as Race City, USA. Well, with due respect to our Carolina friends, the nerve center of stock car racing is still right here. The birthplace of speed is where big decisions are made and the big money goes. It's the seat of power. And for more than a century now, Daytona has also been the mecca to which the Go Fast faithful migrate each winter. It's a wonderful tradition, and we salute 103 years worth of heroes who made it happen. We'll be right back.
Their wheel tracks have long since washed away in the ebb and flow of the Atlantic tide. Their names are often consigned to the back pages of often conflicting library tomes. And so I'm glad we've taken a little time here to reflect, to remember, to recognize, and indeed to glorify the history written in these sands by those first Daytona racers. Hats off to Winton and Olds, of course, to the under-recognized H.T. Thomas, to the always hustling Senator Morgan, to fast Fred Marriott, the secretive Seagrave, and the daring Campbell, and of course to Hogdahl, architect of that first stock car race. Without these men, the story of Daytona racing might be very, very different. Indeed, without them, there might be no story at all. And so as the ghosts of these pioneers race up and down this beach into eternity, I just wanted to come down here and tell them thank you. And thanks to you too for taking time to hear their tale. I'm Dave Despain. So long from the beach.
We reached a speed of about 200. I'm quite satisfied with that first run.